The host of Joe's Great Books is Joe Sharkey. He teaches at the University of Washington, Tacoma, but is not speaking for or sponsored by the UW. Just ask him. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Joe's Great Books. This is podcast 3 on JRR Tolkien's essay on fairy stories with my special guest, Tony Lang. But first, a preface. As you'll see, this preface turns out to be more a follow-up to the preface to podcast 2 than it is a preface to podcast 3. I wanted it to be a quick 1-minute bit, but found I couldn't do that responsibly, so I apologize to my fans. As you both know, I'm a stalwart free speech avocado. In the very first podcast, 2 podcasts ago, I said I plan to make free speech an undercurrent of the show, and recently there have been a handful of positive developments I want to cheer. I'll be sure to pick my spots going forward. I won't report every bit of notable news, I'll leave that to fire, but I will comment when I like, especially when I think I have some insight to add, as I do here. The thesis for today is that although declarations of a commitment to free speech by university administrators, and even written policies stipulating that commitment, are very welcome, like water in a desert welcome, they are insufficient to establish and maintain the atmosphere of free speech and inquiry essential to a college campus. In addition to such policies and declarations, universities also need to adopt the institution-neutral stance recommended by the Kalven Report. I don't see many universities doing that anytime soon, though, so for now we'll have to approximate it by an infusion of faculty or alumni-sponsored free speech groups that will serve the university by fostering the proper atmosphere of freedom by their own statements, events, and courses. And, when necessary, play the role of watchdog when the administration of smaller units within a university, or the university as a whole, decides to signal its virtue by standing strong with activists pushing the latest political trend. Now, if you're just here for the literature, you can skip the next 16 to 17 minutes. So, Richard, go ahead. But, Mom, you have to watch it. Or you might choose to watch it 2 times speed, which, as we all know, makes it funny. You can imagine you're listening to Alvin the Chipmunk or Ben Shapiro, both free speech champions in their own ways. I took a quick and much-deserved shot at Stanford Law School last podcast, alluding to an incident that took place on March 9th, 2023, when their students drowned out a speaker whom a student group had invited to speak to them, a circuit judge, no less. Rather than remind the future lawyers and judges of Stanford's policies on free speech, an associate dean for diversity, equity, and inclusion stepped in and condoned the students' behavior, asking rhetorically if the juice was worth the squeeze, by which he was asking whether or not the discomfort of hearing a judge express views that run contrary to most but not all of the Stanford students was worth the benefits that might accrue. And her answer was clearly and ridiculously, nope. I'll point out here that throughout this preface, I'm not going to talk about the particular views of any of the speakers, since those are beside the point. In any case, the Stanford story took a happy turn. The dean of the law school, backed by the president of the university, righted the ship by apologizing to the judge, ordering the students to attend free speech training, sounds to me like free spanking, and then publishing a 10-page defense of free speech herself. What did we say in podcast 1 about making mistakes? That we should expect ourselves and other humans and human institutions to make them, and not be too harsh on them when they do. Moreover, we should cheer those who make them, but then make up for them. So bravo, Stanford and Dean Martinez. Her apology letter to the judge makes clear that the adults at Stanford Law know that the right to free speech does not imply the right to yell so loudly that somebody else can't speak freely. The latter document, the free speech defense, is superb, in part for the other documents it quotes. Dean Martinez begins with Stanford's Statement on Academic Freedom of 1974. Stanford University's central functions of teaching, learning, research, and scholarship depend upon an atmosphere in which freedom of inquiry, thought, expression, publication, and peaceable assembly are given the fullest protection. Expression of the widest range of viewpoints should be encouraged, free from institutional orthodoxy and from internal or external coercion." End quote. I emphasized with my voice the part I think is most crucial, Not just policies typed out somewhere, but an atmosphere of free thought and expression. If you've strayed onto a university campus recently, you might correctly infer that the atmosphere of most is more like that of a strict religious sect. In other words, an atmosphere of orthodoxy. Martinez also quotes a line from a Supreme Court decision of 1957, Sweezy versus State of New Hampshire. Quote, "It is the business of a university to provide that atmosphere which is most conducive to speculation, experiment, and creation." End quote. I think we're all glad that George Jefferson's wife won that case. Best of all, she, Martinez, not Wheezy, turns out to be, like me, a Calvinist. In other words, she supports the 1967 Kalven report for the University of Chicago. She quotes the following from that report. "The mission of the university is the discovery, improvement, and dissemination of knowledge. Its domain of inquiry and scrutiny includes all aspects and all values of society. A university faithful to its mission will provide enduring challenges to social values, policies, practices, and institutions. By design and by effect, it is the institution which creates discontent with the existing social arrangements and proposes new ones. In brief, a good university, like Socrates, friend of the show, will be upsetting. The instrument of dissent and criticism is the individual faculty member or the individual student. The university is the home and sponsor of critics. It is not itself the critic. It is, to go back once again to the classic phrase, a community of scholars. To perform its mission in the society, a university must sustain an extraordinary environment of freedom of inquiry and maintain an independence from political fashions, passions, and pressures. A university, if it is to be true to its faith in intellectual inquiry, must embrace, be hospitable to, and encourage the widest diversity of views within its own community." End badass quote. Well, as a pretty direct consequence of Dean Martinez's ground standing, we have more good news on the free speech front. 3 strong statements were made by other universities, 2 by top-notch schools, and 1 also by Penn State. Fire calls this the Stanford effect. First, Cornell. When in late March, the Student Assembly passed a resolution mandating, the Student Assembly mandates? As I said, mandating content warnings for traumatic content in the classroom. The president of Cornell, Martha E. Pollack, promptly nixed it, writing, "Learning to engage with difficult and challenging ideas is a core part of a university education, essential to our students' intellectual growth." End quote. Imagine that. She followed up in mid-April with an announcement that begins with this excerpt from the Supreme Court's 1937 decision, Palco versus Connecticut. "Freedom of expression is the matrix, the indispensable condition of nearly every other form of freedom." President Pollack continues in her own words now, quote, "Free expression is the bedrock of democracy, just as academic freedom is the bedrock of higher education. These twin freedoms are at the heart of our core values and have always been fundamental to Cornell's excellence and its identity. Today, as we witness assaults on free expression and academic freedom from both ends of the political spectrum, it is vitally important that we, as a community of scholars, engage deeply with these values and the issues that can emerge in upholding them. To this end, I'm glad to announce our university-wide theme for the 2023-24 academic year, the indispensable condition, freedom of expression at Cornell." Well done, President Pollack. A full-throated declaration of free expression with no qualifiers, plus a year-long jubilee. Second, Penn State. PSU's President Neeli Bendapudi recorded a video in early April in which she made a statement in favor of free speech as essential to the mission of American universities. I think it's strong overall, but with an important flaw. She makes a good start by declaring that Penn State will host controversial speakers that semester. She agrees with President Pollack. College kids should expect controversy at college. Then it becomes a little concerning. Of these speakers, she says that, quote, some are controversial because their views are not widely held, which she calls, quote, a difference for intellectual debate. But others, quote, espouse views which are actively hateful to members of our community, and she, quote, stands with those who condemn them, end quote. Now, I don't know which speakers or what issues or what members of the Penn State community the president had in mind, and I decided not to try to find out. Again, it's not the topic that matters. The point is that President Bendapudi is being too blithe in assuming, before she hears what these speakers might say on campus, that she and Penn Staters and everyone of good conscience can distinguish clearly between views that are uncommon and views that are malicious. In other words, she's begging the whole question. Now, I'm quite sure the students of Stanford Law and the diversity dean who stood with them would say they drowned out the judge exactly because he espoused views and made judicial rulings that, in their fallible opinion, were actively hateful to members of their community. Happily, though, President Bendapudi clearly implies that the approach the hecklers at Stanford took would not be acceptable at Penn State. So I'm a fan again when she says, you may ask why we would allow such speakers on our campuses in the first place, and goes on to offer two reasons. The first is the First Amendment. Yay. I love the fact that she adds, quote, this is a right that we are fortunate to enjoy in this country. That is not the case everywhere in the world, end quote. Go President Bendapudi. Yes, the First Amendment, when we abide by it, makes the United States better than other countries. Let's keep it that way. She's also excellent as she continues, quote, the second reason is a moral one. For centuries, higher education has fought against censorship, and for the principle that the best way to combat speech is with more speech. To combat bad ideas is with better ideas. If we, as a public institution, censor messages with which we disagree, it opens us all to censorship when anyone disagrees with any message from any member of our community. None of us wants to learn or work on a campus where we are not free to express our own deeply held beliefs, opinions, perspectives. End quote. Overall, as I said, the statement is strong, but I do think there is a conflict. If a student or faculty member or staff member knows that the president, or a dean, or the great majority of the faculty, or anyone on campus with power or a mission statement, stands against a visiting speaker in a controversial national debate, is a student or faculty or staffer truly free to express his or her deeply held beliefs if they agree with the speaker against whom the powers of the university stand? Clearly not. And perhaps most consequentially, when certain beliefs are written into job ads, as diversity, equity, and inclusion statements are very widely now, including at my school, the University of Washington. A situation like what Tocqueville called the tyranny of the majority takes shape. You might be free to express your deeply held beliefs, you just aren't likely to get hired or to remain hired, unless you have tenure. That's why colleges and universities ought to be Calvinists. They ought to regard the university as the home and sponsor of critics, but not itself the critic. They ought not to signal their virtue as institutions with regard to political or social debates of the day, because doing so makes it more difficult for the individuals that constitute those institutions to ask questions about and freely argue for positions in those debates. The foundational virtue universities ought to signal as institutions is the pursuit of truth and the steadfast commitment to the freedom of speech and thought that is necessary for that. Which brings us to our last bit of good news. At Harvard, experimental psychologist Steven Pinker, here to die for, and Bertha Madras, a professor of psychobiology at Harvard Medical School, together with 50 other Harvard faculty, have established the new Council on Academic Freedom to defend intellectual diversity against the growing campus orthodoxy. Pinker and Madras say, quote, the mission of a university is to seek and share truth. The reason that a truth-seeking institution must sanctify free expression is straightforward. No one is infallible or omniscient. not even Steven Pinker's hair. Mortal humans begin in ignorance of everything and are saddled with cognitive biases that make the search for truth or for knowledge arduous. These include overconfidence in their own rectitude, a preference for confirmatory over disconfirmatory evidence, and a drive to prove their own alliance is smarter and nobler than their rivals. The only way that our species has managed to learn and progress is by a process of conjecture and refutation. Some people venture ideas, others probe whether they are sound, and in the long run, the better ideas prevail." End quote. In other words, they agree with John Stuart Mill, as they go on to show when they write that, quote, "Even when the academic consensus is almost certainly correct, as with vaccines and climate change, skeptics can understandably ask, why should we trust the consensus if it comes out of a clique that brooks no dissent?" End quote. Mill argued that we should always listen to dissenters, not just when the established view is wrong or partly wrong and therefore in need of correction, but even when it is correct, since only a view that can defend itself against all comers truly deserves our trust. I might have chosen the roundness of the earth as my go-to example of something we're sure of, especially given that once you acknowledge that, you don't have to delve into very controversial debates about what social or governmental policies it does or doesn't call for. But I don't take this statement to be implying any of those. In any case, let's not quibble. Bravo for the Crimson Council on Academic Freedom. I've linked the announcement in the Boston Globe. It's short and well worth reading. The best line, in my view, is, quote, "When activists are shouting into an administrator's ear, we will speak calmly but vigorously into the other one, which will require them to take the reasoned rather than the easy way out." Let's hope so. Well, unfortunately, the news isn't all good because there's also San Francisco State. In response to an invited speaker, some students listened civilly, while others tried to shout her down during the speech and then afterwards, as a threatening mob yelled profanity and gesticulated at her in the hallway outside. The speaker says a protester hit her. In any case, police had to take her to a secure room and keep her there for hours until the coast was clear. The president of SFSU, Lynn Mahoney, addressed the matter in a trio of statements, and she did at least declare respect for freedom of speech. But it was as I was reading through them that I recognized that a simple yay or boo wasn't going to cut it, either for her or for PSU President Bendapudi. President Mahoney's statements are instructive for where they fall short, and they fall very short. Her first begins, quote, "Last week was a hard one for San Francisco State. As an academic community, we are deeply committed to academic freedom, freedom of expression, and to the right to teach and learn free from censorship. But, as we have seen here and at many universities, balancing these with dearly held commitments to inclusion and social justice is hard and painful." And there's the key. You cannot serve these two masters. And in fact, a university, especially a state university, should aspire to serve only one. A case made eloquently by Jonathan Haidt of Heterodox Academy in his 2016 essay, "Why Universities Must Choose One Telos, Truth or Social Justice." I'll add the link below. The attempt to serve both at SFSU takes us back to the weakness in Penn State President Bendapudi's statement. When a university self-righteously takes sides on a controversial political or moral issue, the atmosphere of free speech dissipates and the tyranny of the majority ascends. President Mahoney's other two statements declare respect for the First Amendment, but it's clear which telos is winning. Her heart is with the students who claimed that the speaker's expression of a contrary view was, quote, "deeply traumatic," and, quote, "outraged many members of the SF state community who value inclusion and social justice," end quote. My question: will the adults at Penn State be able to maintain civility when some very controversial speaker comes to campus, one that these same adults have condemned in advance? We will see, and I will be rooting for them. But the SFSU response was just too weak. When a sizable number of your students, like those at Stanford Law, shout down or threaten a speaker, your job is to tell them that they are on the wrong side of hysteria. And in place of their parents, we might say, scold them for their ignorance, immaturity, and ingratitude for the privilege of being in college, and for living in a nation governed by the First Amendment, as President Bendapudi reminded the PSU student body. To wrap it all up, crucial to each of these statements is a proper understanding of the terms diversity and inclusion, which are so often nowadays on college campuses mere misnomers for uniformity of viewpoint and exclusion of the wrong one. The statements out of Stanford, Penn State, Cornell, and Harvard all get it right. Diversity of viewpoint is the lifeblood of a university, and as such, clearly the most important form of diversity. But, as the Kalven Report says, the university should be the home and sponsor of critics, not itself the critic. Welcome to Joe's Great Books. Today, podcast 3 or 8 or 7, we'll find out later. Anthony F. Lang Jr. on JRR Tolkien's theory of Eucatastrophic. Then we do the song. Welcome to Joe's Great Books. I'm Joe Sharkey, joined by my special guest today, Anthony F. Lang Jr., to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien on Joe's Great Books, a podcast about the Western literary tradition for the common man, the ordinary guy, and the average Joe or average Tony, hosted by one of each today, me and you. Tony, thank you so much for being willing to appear on this fledgling podcast, videocast, and people should know that Tony and I go way back. Good friend of mine, stood up in my wedding, room together in college and then more college. But since you don't know him as well as I do, I think it makes sense to do a little biography. Anthony F. Lang Jr., although his friends call him Tony, was a professor of international political theory at the University of St. Andrews.
In Scotland.
What country is that exactly? St. Andrews?
In the United Kingdom, but in Scotland.
Scotland. I visited Scotland for just like a day. It was lovely. So how many years have you been there?
I've been 18 and a half, something like
18 that. 18 years.
Yep.
So of those 18 years, how many times did you invite your old pal Joe to come visit you?
It's coming. When we come up with a good idea for us to do something intellectual like this, we'll do it in person next time. Rather than a podcast, we'll do it in person.
You know, I did, as I said, I traveled there once, but I think I just stayed overnight once because I didn't know anybody. But
I wasn't here then. Yeah. So.
And just let the record show, practically the instant I get a podcast.
Exactly. Yeah. So
moving right along, he received his BA in philosophy from the University of Notre Dame in 1990. And his MA and PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins University in 1996. Fancy.
Where we also attended together, right? So people should know that Joe was both at Notre Dame with me, and for a year at Johns Hopkins for him, 6 years for me. So.
Yes, when I was studying physics at Notre Dame and then electrical engineering for my career at Johns Hopkins.
Yes.
Right. Tony was an assistant professor in political science at the American University in Cairo from 1996 through 2000. Okay, so you were in Egypt too?
For 4 years, yeah. It's a great time, absolutely. Our oldest son was born there, so.
I've never been to Egypt.
You never been to Egypt? You could have come because you knew I was there, so.
Moving right along.
Yeah. Right. We are friends. We are friends, podcaster audience.
This stint in Cairo was followed by service as a program officer at the Carnegie. Do you say Carnegie or Carnegie?
Carnegie. I say Carnegie.
Carnegie.
They say
Okay,
Carnegie here in Scotland, though, so because he's from Scotland.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So, yes, Joe's Great Books, we slum. So, Carnegie, Council for Ethics in International Affairs from 2000 through 2003. So, Ethics in International Affairs, 2000 to 3. Is that why nothing bad happened during that span?
That's right. So if you think about that period, it was a very calm, peaceful time in world politics. So
because you guys were steering the ship.
We were working on it. Yeah, right.
Where exactly is the CC for EIA located?
In New York City. In fact, I was there on 9/11. I was in the office on 9/11. So
seeing what you guys couldn't ward off. After a year as an assistant professor at Albright College in Reading, Pennsylvania, here I'm making a joke about 9/11. I'm gonna have to edit that shit up.
Yeah,
that's when I moved to the University of St. Andrews, which you might know is in Scotland, which is a lovely place to visit. So I hear. In January of 2021, he became the editor of the Journal of International Political Theory. He served as the consultant for the UK Ministry of Defense and the United Nations Office of Crime and Drugs. Cool. You are on a roll, my friend. Now, could you explain your general research topic? I have a paragraph, but I want to hear it from the horse's mouth.
Yeah. So over the years, I have done lots of different things. My earliest stuff was on humanitarian intervention, and I wrote a number of things on that. Then I wrote about some political theory. So Hannah Arendt, my favorite political theorist, written a lot about her over the years, and a couple other theorists. Aristotle, for instance, have written about Aristotle.
Friend of the show.
And how these people relate to global affairs has been the way that's why I'm a professor of international political theory, as opposed to just political theory. So does Aristotle have any relevance for global politics? And I make a case he does. That's a different podcast, but he's really interesting on that stuff. And then written about the just war tradition, kind of military affairs. And now over the last 10, 12 years, I've written on this topic of global constitutionalism, which is what I explain it is, it's not a global constitution, but it's looking at how the international system has become more constitutional over the years. And what does that mean? And how do we interpret it based on domestic constitutions? And so looking at international law, international political institutions, things like that. So, and then in the most recently, this stuff about Tolkien and other stuff, I've gotten interested in the notion of narration and how we narrate things and understanding the global politics. And so that's how I got to Tolkien, although there's other routes I got to him too. So, but so those are the kind of things I work on.
Very cool stuff, wide-ranging but coherent as well. And you taught a class or co-taught a class on speculative fiction.
Speculative fiction, for those who don't know, a way to combine fantasy and science fiction and make one category of a genre. So it's just you're the literature professor, so you know this stuff better than I do. But what were you say?
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt. I was about to say, I find it charming that you think that after a whole career in political science, that you just think you could just step a little bit to the left or to the right and do literature and just teach a class.
At a cool university. It's like reading novels. Like, how hard is that? I mean,
I know, a cool university in Scotland where I've never been. With no no fancy jargon, no lexicon, no Derrida, no Foucault. We actually probably don't know Foucault. And my answer to that is bravo. Congratulations, because that's one of the premises of Joe's Great Books, that anybody can do it. The Joe's in the title, that's not me. It's ordinary Joe's. Anybody is able to do it.
Although, let me say on that one last point, this was probably the first time in probably close to 15 years I was nervous before teaching a class, but it went really well. The students seemed to get it. We got in some great conversations, so it was good. So it went well.
That's proof that you're doing it right, and it's also proof that you don't need a bunch of fancy rigmarole and lexicon and theories. Those can help, but there's really just reading a goddamn story and explaining it and talking about it and figuring it out. If you've got the book, you got the common language, you got some life experience, and you some expertise from outside. Wonderful. You can dive in. So one thing I was hoping you would do is when you introduced your research, I was hoping you would say it as you wrote it, because you say his research focuses on the intersection of ethics, law, and politics at the global level. And so, if you don't mind, if you could say it like that and use the word intersection, and then I will tease you.
You've got a whole joke
I have jokes. It's like a minefield.
Okay, but overall research is the intersection of ethics, law, and politics at the global level, and how those things intersect with each other.
Okay, that's very cool subject matter, but we have a house rule here, Tony. When you talk about your research interests, you can't use the word intersection. So can you say that again, but find some other word?
Intersectionality?
No, that's worse. Get it? Turn the geek
I got it.
Dial the geek dial down.
Yeah.
So
I can't think of a better word. It's the perfect word for it, intersection.
Well, here's some words that you could try.
But overall research is the crisscross, junction, overlap, blend, imbrication, rendezvous, tryst, hookup.
Lovemaking.
Section of ethics, law, and politics at the global level, and how those things intersect with each other.
Tony's written quite a lot. He's written on global constitutionalism, the just war tradition. And as far as I know, that's not like, it's just war, man.
Right,
like
right. No.
War that has justification, right?
Mm-hmm.
Long Catholic tradition.
Exactly.
Just war, right? Political rights, responsibility, human rights, humanitarian intervention in the political theory of Hannah Arendt, Hans Morgenthau, and Aristotle, as we said before. Friend of the show, hope to have him on soon. Tony's recent work focuses on universal values, narrative, and global politics, academic freedom, and virtue ethics. If I were a political scientist, Tony, I would be a half-assed version of you. And here's why. He has published 3 single-authored books. 3, that's 2 more than me. And edited and co-edited 9 others. 9. That's like this many. And
that's a lot.
That's 9 more than me. I've edited or co-edited 0.
Edited books are not necessarily, they're great. I like doing them, but they can be a lot of chasing up academics who are incapable of keeping deadlines or anything. So
academics, I hate academics.
I do too.
They're absolutely the worst. He's also published numerous academic journal articles, book chapters, opinion pieces, and online blogs. But as yet, 0 podcasts.
Exactly. Yep.
His publications can be found at a website that I will put in the notes in case people want to visit that. Doesn't make sense to try to read off the hieroglyphics. And he tweets at Prof. Tony Lang. Dude, you tweet?
I'm a tweeter. I'm a Twitter guy. Yeah. I know Elon Musk personally. I mean, we're like this.
I don't tweet. I think I've twat twice. But I am on Twitter for Joe's Great Books, and I will kind of start tweeting to the people that for some reason follow me, even though I haven't even done anything or, as I said, tweeted.
I follow you. I think I probably follow
you. Dude, you better. But after this episode, earthquake, I'll have hordes of people follow me to figure out what's going on in the world of political science. What I usually do when I invite people on the show, given that I give them absolutely 0 compensation, is I say, we'll talk about whatever the hell you think would be appropriate. And so Tony said, I'm teaching this class on speculative fiction, and I'm reading up on fairy tales. And somebody that came to mind was JRR Tolkien. And I was like, Tolkien, that's awesome. So what book are we going to talk about? The Hobbit? Bilbo, Gollum, The Ring, Gandalf, Smaug? And he said no. And I said, so Lord of the Rings, we're actually going to go to Lord of the Rings. So we're going to talk about Frodo and Sam, and again the Ring, and again Gollum, and again Gandalf, and Saruman, and Sauron, and Nazgul. And he said no. And so what he decided that we should talk about for 3 hours today is an essay whose title I've even forgotten. I know it's on fairy tales.
On fairy stories.
You're right, on fairy stories. And this was part of the Andrew Lang lectures at a very eminent college, university, St. Andrews, right?
Yes. I'll give you the quick narrative about the origin of the lecture. All right, because it was a lecture. So I'll try not to take too long doing this. But so Andrew Lang, who is no relation to me, there's a Scottish Lang, I'm a German Lang, so it's a different Lang. He was a late 19th, early 20th century, very famous Scottish academic. He wrote on history, fairy tales. He wrote he wrote his own fairy tales. He wrote as well on what we would now call early anthropology, but also commentary on golf, on all sorts of things. So the guy wrote an immense amount. And then when he died, they created a lecture series in his name that still goes on to this very day at St. Andrews. It doesn't happen every year, but it goes on sometimes. And so Tolkien came to St. Andrews in 1939 from Oxford, and this was right after he had written The Hobbit, but before he had written The Lord of the Rings. So, and he came to give this lecture, and I have the kind of advanced version on fairy stories here. Which has got like commentary from the day, like the different versions of the manuscript. It's great. It's a great read. So anyways, he gave the lecture, and then he revised it for publication later that went into a volume that was edited by his good friend C.S. Lewis for a guy named Charles Williams, who was part of the Inklings. That was the group of them that used to meet together. And that, so it was published there, and then it went through various publishing things, and it's been published in different versions over the years. So, but it originally was a talk. So originally it was a lecture. The first version reads like a lecture, and then he revised it over the years. So, yeah,
very cool. So is that book a collection of essays, or is it actually all on fairy stories plus
no
material?
It's very kind of history of ideas. It's basically the version of the lecture, commentary by just these two authors, and then like 3 different versions of it with showing out where he crossed out stuff, and so it kind of tells you the story of how he came to the ideas that he came to, and a lot of footnotes and kind of descriptions of stuff. So it's good stuff.
That's super cool. I didn't realize how big an essay it was. I don't even think I knew about it until you brought it to my attention. So very cool, and I'm very impressed that you have this bloodline. I mean, Andrew Lang, your grandfather on your paternal side, and then Tolkien was your great grandfather on your maternal side, right? Do I have that straight?
And Gandalf is my ultimate grandfather. So.
Right. He's everybody's grandfather.
Exactly.
Everyone who loves fantasy or speculative fiction, a very hard thing to say, apparently. So what we're going to do today is go through the essay in skeletal form. It's over 40 pages, if I recall correctly. And it's very interesting, very much worth reading, but too long for a podcast, especially when we keep screwing around. And we'll go through that, and we'll emphasize what seems to be the climax of his essay, this concept of Eucatastrophe. So that's catastrophe with the prefix EU, which, if I recall correctly, means essentially good.
Yes. Yeah,
so it's essentially a good catastrophe, which is a cool concept. After we do that, we will put it to the test a little bit with applying it to at least a couple fairy stories, which I will call fairy tales, even though I like fairy story better. One is the Juniper Tree, and the other is the Bull of Norway, and I think you might bring in others as well. And then I will bring in a story that I think actually fits the concept a little bit better than some of the ones that Tolkien talked about. And we'll go on tangents as we see fit. I have a couple of, at least one pet theory that I think it harmonizes with the theory of Eucatastrophe, and I think maybe takes it in a little bit of a different direction. But then we'll finish up by taking it and applying it to Tony's proper neighborhood, which is political science. And at that point, I will have the happy experience of basically being Tony's student and hearing from him and asking questions as we go. So
sounds good.
Okay, good. So let's take a look at the essay first, and we'll put links to everything that is linkable later. And this is funny. So can you see that menu on the screen? The work.
No.
Oh, okay. I don't know if this is being recorded or not, but Joe's Great Books has a fairly low budget. So we're on Zoom. Thanks to the people at Zoom for letting us use the free version, because I'm too cheap to pay $14.99 even for 1 month. So I don't know if these menus are popping up so people can see them. I actually kind of hope so, and I kind of like it. So I'm just going to put it down to the side. It says work smarter, not harder. Upgrade to Zoom One Pro to save 30%. So it could be even cheaper than $14.99.
Yeah,
still not going to do it. But
all right.
we can make it clear. Zoom, not to be blamed for anything Tony says or credited for anything that I say.
Yes, Mr. Zoom, please don't get in enough trouble.
Okay, so Tolkien spends a lot of time kind of, I think, joking around in wry fashion in the lecture, kind of like we've been doing for the last half hour, talking about what isn't a fairy story. I'll skip that because it takes a long time. It doesn't really take us to the good stuff. But let's talk about how English fairy stories are about the realm of fairy. And he spells it the cool way, F-A-E-R-I-E. And the spelling, Tolkien, as people probably know, is a kind of a master of languages and an inventor of his own languages. And so he loved language and the kind of the sound and the feel and the etymology. And I wish I could go the places he goes, but just spelling it a little bit differently is a little bit estranging. It makes you feel like you're going into some fantasy world. But he says that the fairy stories are not really about fairies. They're about the land of fairy, or the state of fairy, where fairies happen to have their being, and where we do, he says, as he mentions more than once, when we are enchanted. So I like that. I like to think that if you're reading a good book of any kind, that you're in a kind of state of enchantment. So he says the good fairy stories, are the best ones, are about not fairies, but about men's adventures in, say, the perilous realm, a term from Arthurian romance. We'll do a podcast someday on the like a really old version of the Quest of the Holy Grail, which is pretty cool. About that sometime. Maybe you since you're now a literature PhD too, pick it up for the weekend. You could join me for that show. Where we have our rare meetings with fairies. And he says that it's the nature of the fairy realm that matters, but it's something that is inexpressible. It cannot quite, as he puts it, be caught in a net of words. I love that expression. The magic, as he puts it, of fairy is that it satisfies primordial human desires. And that seems to ring true to me. And one thing that he mentioned that I had never thought of as a primordial human desire was our ability to communicate to non-human elements of the world. Talk to animals or talk to a rock. Oh,
that's good.
So very cool. And you can tell as you're reading this, especially if you know a little bit about Tolkien, that he has his own stories in mind. And so his stories clearly are something of fairy stories. And he's kind of, it seems to me, as you said, he's between his two great works, The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And you can tell he's kind of giving a game plan to us, or as well to himself. So one folk tale, the one he mentions at this point, is the Juniper Tree. They have, as he calls it, an unanalyzable effect. That's a quote. So a scholar cannot explain it or spoil it, or cannot explain it sufficiently without spoiling it. What they do, he says, is they take us to an other time, and he capitalizes the O and the T, so it's very formal, kind of transcendent, Platonic idea. Has a name, a proper name, and he glosses that as saying that maybe it's outside time itself. So here it seems to me he's hinting at this big conclusion of what happens when a fairy story succeeds, when it's a Eucatastrophe. He talks about children, and here it was fun to me because I felt as if I could tell where he was going. I could sense the Catholic in him working his way up to a Catholic conclusion. So he talks about children, and he goes on to some at some length about how they don't. He denies that they have some special connection. Spells cool with an X at the end instead of a CT. With fairy stories. And it seems pretty clear that he wants to, or he's insisting that, look, fairy stories are not just for kids. It's not about the fact that they are credulous in the way we think of children as being credulous, that is, well, inexperienced and therefore a little bit dumb, willing to believe in a fib. So you can tell he wants, and he does say it later, look, fairy stories are something that adults can tap into. And the credulity that they foster in us is not something to be looked down upon or something to mature beyond.
And let me jump in there because and I don't know, because there's so many versions of the essay. I don't know. So my version, when he's talking about the children, There's a footnote, which is my favorite footnote ever, where he says, so that he's saying like, well, people like, do you believe in fairy? Nobody believes this world exists, but he's saying, what do children ask? He said, far more often they have asked me, was he good? Was he wicked? That is, they're more concerned to get the right and the wrong side clear, for that is a question equally important in history and in fairy. So they don't, like, kids don't care as much about, is this, they know it's not real, but they care about, is he good or bad? Is the hero good or, which I think is so both Catholic, but also so important about why I like this kind of stuff. So yeah.
I love that. Thank you. I don't, I didn't know there was more than one version of the essay. So
okay.
I don't know that cool book that has, the production, the origin story of the essay, but that would be cool. There's one passage that I do remember him saying, I think he's talking about your uncle Andrew Lang, who said that one of the stories, or one of the questions that children always want to ask is, well, is it true?
Yeah.
So that's in your essay too. So that's different, but it seems to me that the two harmonize, because what Tolkien thinks the kids really want to know is, is it true maybe in a deeper sense than did it happen in history at this particular date?
Exactly. Yeah. So I've got this, mine has this footnote to that quote where he's quoting Lang there, is it true? And then he goes, they care less about is it true in the believable sense, is it real? They care more about, is it true in that deeper sense, like you just said. So I think that's absolutely it. Yeah.
Oh, good. That's wonderful. Yeah, I didn't see that footnote, but it encourages me that I'm following along correctly.
Yeah.
A quote that and so what kind of brings us together, I think, is a quote that's at least on my text, it's page 21. He says, if a fairy story is worth reading at all, it is worthy to be written for and read by adults.
Yeah.
I think we qualify for. So you can tell that what he's got in mind is a kind of faith, his Catholic faith, and that he's kind of building us up to that moment. I could see it coming.
Yeah, you knew it. You're just like Tolkien.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, him being my great aunt. So this is the part that I think is super cool, and this is the part that kind of resonated with me most. He says that a storyteller, when he any kind of storyteller who succeeds becomes a sub-creator.
Yeah.
This is where he starts going biblical, and you can tell he's alluding to Genesis even before he quotes it, and he does quote it, I think, at one point. But he says a sub-creator is someone who makes a secondary world with its own laws by which his world abides.
Yeah.
So sub-creator, well, what is the creator sub to? Well, God. So God creates this world, the world we're in. But as he says later, and he quotes Genesis, the very end of Genesis, and I might as well get the biblical, or get it exactly. In Genesis 1, I think this is probably the New Revised Standard Version, 26 to 27. So the first part of 26 is, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, using the plural, which always makes people curious when they look at it the first time or the second. Skipping to 27, he says, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. So people have interpreted that in all sorts of different ways. What does it mean to be created in his image? Is he anthropomorphic? Does he have 2 arms and 2 legs and walk in the garden, as he seems to do in Genesis 3, when he's walking and Adam and Eve hear him coming and they've eaten from the tree, so they hide. So sometime we'll do a podcast on the documentary hypothesis and look at the difference between the different strands. Genesis, at least as people theorize, but
right.
But the cool thing is that when he talks about sub-creation, it taps into one common interpretation of what it means to be created in the image of God. What is God doing in Genesis? Well, he's creating, like the Big Bang God. Let there be this, let there be that. He shapes this. So rudely interrupted by Zoom to see if we can find the thread again. I was talking about how in Genesis, God is creating everything. Boom, 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 Big Bang God. And at the end, he says, or the Genesis author says that humans were created in his image, male and female. It's interesting, and it's very patriarchal text. The author is very careful to say male and female, he created them. And as I was saying before we were interrupted, it's natural to think at the end of all of this creation. You think, well, what is God? And you don't really get that much information about what God is, except what he's doing. And so if God can Big Bang, right, men and women can Big Bang too. They can make their own sub-creation.
Right.
Did that come out suggestive?
A little bit. But anyways, but yeah, so on the creator point, let me make this quick kind of interjection on the creator point, because I think it's a really interesting one. So as I said at the beginning, that Lewis or Tolkien was friends with C.S. Lewis, and they met regularly, and they read each other's works, they commented each other's fiction and everything. And Tolkien was not happy with Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia because it had so many not weird, but like draws from so many different traditions, like Greek mythology, Norse mythology, fairy tales, everything is in there.
Like bric-a-brac.
Exactly, yeah, bric-a-brac, exactly. Imbrication. There's an imbrication.
I love that word.
Yeah, it's
I have to look that up.
Yeah, or palimpsest. Isn't that a literary word?
Wow. I usually say chalkboard because, down to earth.
Yeah. So Tolkien obviously spent a lot of time making sure his world was coherent and creating a world that made sense and was logical, and also has his own creator story. That he has a god in the Silmarillion that creates the world, and there's angels and all sorts of stuff. And so it's a fascinating. I think it's really interesting. This creator, and I think it goes back to his idea in this essay, the importance of seeing yourself as a sub-creator when you're an author. A literary author, you're creating a world as well. So
I saw recently, I think I mentioned to you in an email exchange before we did the podcast about Tolkien, and I was reading through it. You'd suggested it a long time ago, and then something kind of got in the way in my life, and so I put it to the side. And when I went back to it, I had forgotten it was by Tolkien, and for the first, 10 pages, I was thinking it was Lewis.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
And then I realized, whoa, different guy, because I kept thinking Narnia. Because that seems to me more like the fairy story or fairy tale world that I tend to think of, but Tolkien has his own ideas. And so I was looking at something on Twitter, and there's a kind of recurrent joke, I guess it's a kind of meme about Tolkien and Lewis, where people who are fans of both will say that Tolkien, here's how Tolkien would handle this situation. It was like write his own encyclopedia and invent 3 languages and spend 10 years of research to make it work. And then Lewis would say something like, so they walked through the wardrobe and happened in front of saw the light stand or the telephone pole or something like that. And
right, exactly.
You can imagine Tolkien being kind of grousing a little bit, annoyed at how Lewis, gets away with just kind of a little curlicue and says volumes. Tolkien, of course, as you're pointing out, seems to think, okay, I need to create this world in the way God created this world.
Right.
The entirety of it, from the bottom up, so that it's like taking Hemingway's maxim of knowing everything that could be asked about your work, even if you don't verbalize it, right? But you should have an answer for any question someone could ask you. It should all be there in the foundation, even if it's not explicit. So Tolkien's big that.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I do wonder if the magician's nephew, in the Chronicles of Narnia, I wonder if that's kind of his response to Tolkien, maybe, only because, like, I remember when I was a kid and I first read that the lamppost is when you in this world. I'm like, why is a lamppost in this magical world? And then there's the whole story of the guy throwing the piece of iron and a lamppost grows. So maybe that was his effort to kind of get. I have no idea. I'm making that up, but it sounds like it makes sense as a way to. Here's my response to you, JRR.
Yes, that's like the curly cue. You spent 10 years. I just This just occurred to me off the top of my head.
Right.
Yeah, that's funny. And we mentioned as we were re-zooming after Zoom cruelly cut us off that you started talking about the Silmarillion and how there's a creation song where God sings the world into being. And I thought you were talking about Lewis. Apparently, I keep jumping the rails because I remember that passage from The Magician's Nephew, which is, I think, one of the beautiful in all of Narnia, where Aslan sings things into existence.
It's great. I agree with you. I love that. I love that part of the Magician. I agree. So
well, and it's wonderful too because it makes you think of the ancient epic poems, like the epic or the Odyssey and the Iliad. And the Odyssey, at least one translation, begins "Sing in me, Muse," and so Homer is not the songwriter. He's not even, you could say, the singer. He's the flute that the Muse plays through. and he makes this wonderful creation, which and is a very, now that I think about it, a very direct instance of sub-creation in the Greek tradition too. And so you think of God in Genesis, we don't tend to think of that as, an artist's poem or song, but maybe we should. And that's probably what he's doing is he's writing a tale. And part of that tale is you and me and this very podcast.
Yeah, there you go.
Pretty complex. I think God took the Tolkien route more often than the C.S. Lewis. So I'm going to come back to that because and I love the way we got into that, and then we went back to the Greek myth because it bears out that point that I'm going to try out on you once we get summarizing Tolkien's essay. So let's see, where were we? The sub-creation. You can see how he's getting Christian here, getting biblical, getting Genesis. And he says this is kind of the heart of fairy, or the desire behind fairy. Oh, and here's one detail I wanted to bring up before when we were talking about kids. So this is a little bit off the topic, but worth bringing in. Chesterton. I'm learning more about Chesterton. That would be a great podcast too. Especially if I could find someone who's an expert at Chesterton. He said, quote, "Children are innocent and therefore love justice." And when we get to the myths, I'll talk about that because that may be something throwing me off. And this might actually explain why I am not quite sold that the theory of eucatastrophe, which we haven't gotten to yet, fits those myths. But he goes on, and here's the punch. He says, "Children are innocent and therefore they love justice, semicolon, while most of us are wicked and naturally prefer mercy."
That is a brilliant quote. I agree with that. I guess, like, wow. I mean,
And that I've been thinking that, and I will get to it later. But where's the mercy? And so now I know why. It's because I'm wicked. And the worst of it, when we get to the Juniper Tree, it's practically proof.
Absolutely. Proof. Talk about wicked. So
that'll be fun to go through, and also a little bit shaming on my part, but you'll find out why. I have an anecdote. So one of Tolkien's crucial claims is that fantasy is free of the domination of fact. It presents images of things not to be found in our primary world. So that's fascinating. God, the primary creator, creates us. We potentially can be sub-creators, and we create our world, little bangs. And in those things, we can create things that don't exist in the world that God created, except, a second remove. He created things that created new things. And so he says that sub-creation, for example, making a world in which a green sun is credible, is, as he puts it, story making in its primary and most potent mode. He says fantasy has an arresting strangeness. And he says there are some people who dislike being arrested, which is funny. He likes being arrested, and I think most people who love literature like being arrested. And that doesn't, not by the police, but just like grabbed, jarred so that your jaw drops. So you experience a kind of awe or wonder or maybe fear if you're thinking as I am, you're thinking about the Juniper Tree. Freaking story. But he says they don't seem to like any meddling in the primary world. And I can't help thinking or suspecting that Tolkien is thinking of atheists here.
It could be,
and building in, refutations or apologetics, as it were, into his theories as he goes, even though he never comes back to that and makes it explicit. Let's go to the main point here. It says that when fairy stories work in these, we have this act of sub-creation, and it's believable, it's credible, we suspend our disbelief, we enter the world, we are enchanted. But he says that the key is that at the climax, you have what he calls this eucatastrophe. You have a eucatastrophic conclusion. And I'll just quote from him here. He says, "Far more important than what he talked about before is the consolation of the happy ending. Almost I would venture to assert that all complete fairy stories must have it. At least I'd say that while tragedy is the true form of drama, that's its highest function, the opposite is true of fairy story." So he doesn't use this language, but if he's distinguishing it from tragedy, he must mean that fairy stories are comic in the sense of, say, Dante's Divine Comedy. The further you go back in time, the simpler the definition of comedy gets. It's just that instead of having a tragic ending where things end badly, you have a comic ending where things end happily, things are successful. And so this is his concept of eucatastrophe. There is a kind of catastrophe at the end, so things go down. But then, as he puts it, there is a kind of good catastrophe, the sudden joyous joyous turn. So even if the tragedy is long and sloping like this, at the end you have this sudden upward motion, redemption, or at least in some cases, resurrection. So, he says, and this is, I think, is key. He says that the good catastrophe, the eucatastrophe, is not escapist. It is not a wish or fulfillment of a wish, but it is, as he puts it, a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. So he says that it doesn't deny the, as he puts it, the existence of discatastrophe, which sounds to me like a catastrophic catastrophe, one that ends badly and then maybe stays bad or worse. But the eucatastrophe brings us to the joy of deliverance. And he says it denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will. So I have to remember that, because that's part of my beef on him, is that eucatastrophe seems counter-experiential. So he defended against that. He says that against the face of much evidence, it denies universal final defeat, and insofar is evangelium. It's gospel. It is to preach a kind of good news and to convert, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world. And I love this phrase, poignant as grief. A grief that it seems to me answers or is comparable to the deep grief you feel at the peak, or you could say the nadir, the low point of a catastrophe. You feel this joy that is similar in the kind of, it's so joyous, it's a kind of pain.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think at one point he talks about it as a piercing glimpse, which is I think even an even better adjective for it. It's a piercing glimpse of joy. And the last thing I'll say is that he goes on to say that what in part accounts for this joy is that it gives a sudden glimpse of the underlying reality or truth of the world. And what is fascinating to me is that he seems to be talking about not the truth within the, so you have God here, then you have his creation, this world here, and then in the lower world, the sub-creation, which we can create, writers of fantasy. It seems to me that what he's saying is that in that lower world, you have a piercing glimpse of truth or higher reality, and it doesn't just take us up to our world, the secondary world. It takes us all the way up, I think, to the real with a capital R, the capital T truth. In other words, to the primary world's truth, to God's, the truth of God's creation. He doesn't put it this way, but what fascinates me is it seems to me that what he's saying is essentially that fantasy or fiction of this kind, well, it is a kind of religious undertaking. Paradoxically, you can get, by going less real, by going away from your world, which is already a creation, you can go down into a world that is presumably less real, no matter how much work Tolkien does in preparing the languages in the world. But through that less real world, you can wrap around to the highest reality. So getting less real, we can get more real or most real. It's clearly like the allegory of the cave from Plato, right?
I mean, turning away from what we think is real and then seeing, oh, goodness, there's actually something way more important that I'm not seeing that's more concrete. It's also the other kind of connection would be, since we've already mentioned the Chronicles of Narnia, at the end of at the last battle, when they go to basically heaven in his world, and there's this kind of line where like the grass is actually sharper and greener. It actually hurts their feet when they're walking. And I always, when I was a kid, I remember reading that, like, what? That doesn't make sense. But then you think about it, and it's like, of course, heaven is going to be more everything will taste better, everything will be better. And that includes our sensory experience of the world. So I think that's also what Tolkien's getting at. Same kind of idea there.
That's wonderful. And at the risk of losing the buzz here, I want to point out just a fun thing I remember about you is that you're a man who likes a good cigar, right?
Yeah, I used to, not anymore. Yeah.
I remember you lighting up one time with a cigar in your mouth and the lighter over here talking out this side of your mouth. And you're saying sometimes a good cigar is just a good cigar. Now, what that connects with, bizarrely, here's how my brain works, is that C.S. Lewis, doesn't C.S. Lewis answer a question about what heaven will be like? And I think there might even be an essay, and I wasn't thinking about it until what you just said about the sharp grass. I think there's an essay where he says something like, are there cigars in heaven?
Yeah,
And his
yeah, yeah,
basic
yeah.
answer is, hell yeah, of course there's
Of course, there's
cigars.
cigars, right? We sit around
So,
drinking port in our Oxford rooms with our cigars. Like that's
yeah.
exactly what heaven would be like for those guys, for sure. That's exactly what heaven was. Yeah,
Exactly, the inklings that they have heaven. I mentioned in the first podcast that Socrates in the Apology talks about two possibilities for death. Is one is just click, the light goes out, and the other, eternal great book seminar. What could be better than that? Joe's
or
great
Joe's
book
podcast. It's
forever and
either
ever.
one.
Right.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
I think the idea with him is what you were saying is that the highest world is not something, at least I think he was, so I don't know, I'm obviously speculating or conjecturing, but maybe it's not so absolutely foreign as it is. Maybe it's something a lot like what we have here, but well, sharpened or heightened or
yeah,
real or more real than that.
yeah,
So
yeah.
that's
Absolutely.
cool. So
Yeah,
here's
yeah,
here's, here's
definitely.
my pet theory before we go on
Okay.
to apply it. Came up in conversation with my daughter, and one of those old questions that people who like literature occasionally ask themselves is, why do we care so much about fictional characters in a book, in
Yeah,
a TV show, in a movie? Why
yeah,
does it matter to us when they're approaching the cliff, right? That they dodge it and they have a happy ending. Why does
yeah,
it hurt so much when you're seeing Othello about to
yeah,
his mother, his wife, like, don't do it, don't do it, and then he goes
yeah,
down, and you have a kind of more poignant grief,
yeah,
the opposite of the poignant joy that Tolkien talks about. And so it's a wonderful. I think it comes up with Don Quixote. Maybe we were talking about that. She had read some of that, and it's a puzzling thing because you in a way you feel kind of embarrassed, like, oh, it's just a story. It's a TV show.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
an actor. He's off stage.
yeah,
He's fine. He didn't die. Didn't
yeah,
smother his
yeah,
wife. And I think that so the theory I had seems to fit nicely with what Tolkien said. So my answer, and I'm proud of this because it was one of the few times I can remember that I could tell my daughter was impressed with me with my
yeah,
answer.
yeah. Those are rare with kids. Those moments. Yeah, yeah,
I'm pretty sure she wasn't faking, and I think
yeah,
she used the word "cool." Like, that's a cool
yeah,
idea. So I was like,
yeah,
sure.
yeah,
But the twist, I think the answer, you have to come up with a twist. You think, why do we care so much about these fictional creatures that are lower than us? And the answer is, well, how real are you? Are you really that factual? Are
yeah,
you real with a capital R?
yeah,
And to make sense of that, you have to use a Christian frame. You say, well, look, here we are, and we were created, well, by a creator with a capital C. Does it not seem plausible, if the Christian theology is true, that there is a creator who created all of us in this secondary world?
mhm,
Um, is it not logical to think that compared to God's existence, his eternal being, he introduces himself to Moses as, I am who am.
mhm,
He's the being that bees, that doesn't begin
mhm,
and end. It's just always there outside of time. And Tolkien does say, when you get into fantasy, you have this piercing glimpse of this other world, this other time, or maybe outside time altogether. So you get
mhm,
up to that world. But if God looks at us as uh, essentially fictions, lesser realities than his, and he still cares about us, he cares what happens to us. And to go thoroughly Christian, cares enough that one of his three persons enters into the world. Christ becomes man
mhm.
in order to save it. He's watching that car about to go off the cliff, and he
Yeah,
intervenes. It's like us wanting to hop on stage and
yeah,
restrain Othello or explain it to him. No, it's all Iago.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
it
yeah, yeah,
makes
right.
sense. I mean, so the bottom line is, if God cares about this lesser world, well, then
Yeah,
why does it make any sense? Or why doesn't it make sense? And why should we feel any shame about caring
yeah.
about a lesser reality than ours?
That is a good
What do you think?
parental answer and an intellectual answer too, Joe. You did both there.
Would you go so far as to say that it was a cool idea?
Yeah, well, I would call it cool, definitely. Yes.
Hey, two people
Yeah,
think
right.
so.
Yeah,
I'm collecting compliments. All right.
yeah.
So, anything about Eucatastrophe that you think we should say before we actually apply it? Anything I missed,
So,
watched?
yeah, well, the last one, I mean, I know we're going to come back to the Gospels, but so he does at the end of the essay, right? He tells the story. But let me say two things about it. So at the end, he says the Christian story is a eucatastrophe. Okay. So
Yes.
however, what's interesting is he didn't say that at the lecture in St. Andrews. He didn't end that way. He ended
Oh,
before he talked about the Christian, which is really surprising to me that he didn't go that second step in that last step. So the other interesting thing I think about the Eucatastrophe is it's not only that something bad happens, but it's the kind of one of the main characters makes a dumb decision, does something really stupid.
Yes.
But it's okay, and in fact that leads to the happy ending. So I'll just say the one thing people have interpreted his own fiction through this lens, and the Eucatastrophe in the whole Lord of the Rings, including the Hobbit, is the fact that Bilbo doesn't kill Gollum.
Right. Perfect.
And it seems like a really stupid decision, because then Gollum goes and kind of rats out everybody, and it's a big problem. But it's Gollum that then, spoiler for those who've never read The Lord of the Rings, it's Gollum that bites off the finger of Frodo and falls into, and so unless Gollum was there, unless Frodo had made that choice, there would not have been the happy ending of destroying the ring. So
excellent.
He kind of definitely uses this for his own fiction. And I've read a couple of things that says this explicitly. I think he said it somewhere, that this is in the back of my mind when I wrote this, or I can't remember where I read that, but yeah. So
that's very cool, and that does fit perfectly, and it does fit the grand Christian story. If you think that Adam and Eve were here, they were essentially angels and perfect in paradise. They made a mistake, and it was this gratuitous, stupid mistake. They're literally made for each other, living in paradise. Don't eat from that one tree. What do? The next morning, wake up, eat from the tree. So they have a fall, but as many people in the Christian tradition have put it, they call that a happy fall or a happy fall to Felix Culpa. Because what happens is it drives, or it makes necessary the incarnation, that rescue we talked about before. And I use a graph that is similar to this for literature in general. One way a story ends up is as a comedy, and I call it a divine comedy, where you end up here and you're actually higher than you started. So if you start here, you end up here. It's not just that things are restored and you end up at the same level. Only because you go down do you end up higher than you started. So that's a great example of what you were describing. It's the fault that is redeemed. And that's why it seems to me I'm looking for, kind of mercy in these fairy tales. Let me see if this passage fits what you were talking about at the end, when he talks about the Christian culmination. God redeemed the corrupt making creatures, men, in a way that was fitting to this aspect of their strange nature. The Gospels contain a fairy story or a story of a larger kind, which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. So the Gospels are like the grand fairy story. They're mythical and their perfect self-contained significance, and among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable Eucatastrophe. But this story has entered history and the primary world. So he's talking about the same kind of thing I was there. The desire and the aspiration of the subcreation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is the Eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the Eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. I think that's a great place to end the essay there. High drama.
Yeah, definitely.
Our art. All right, so shall we apply it some? Shall we go to the Juniper Tree?
Yeah, sounds good. So
let's apply Tolkien's theory of Eucatastrophe to one of the Grimm's fairy tales called the Juniper Tree. I'd never read it before, but it was in Tolkien's essay, so I read it, eager to see the theory as it applied. And as I've already intimated, I don't think it fits all that well. Maybe Tony disagrees, but I do think that the way it misses is fascinating. So I'm sure people haven't read it. We'll put the information of the version that we used, or at least that I used, in the information or in the notes. I'll just point out that it's translated by D.L. Ashleyman, to give him credit. A wonderful translation. And I think Ashleyman did this wonderful job of making the jarring parts jarring. And it's so fun. Fun. So I'll just read the first sentence, or the first two sentences, to get us into the flow, and then we'll go much more quickly. Long ago, at least 2,000 years, there was a rich man who had a beautiful and pious wife, and they loved each other dearly. I love the way it says long ago, at least 2,000 years. Not concerned about exactly when, but a long time ago. However, they had no children, though they wished very much to have some, and the woman prayed for them day and night, but they didn't get any, and they didn't get any. that by itself, it was won my heart over the repetition. They didn't get it, and they didn't get any. You can imagine an uncle, like yours, Andrew Lang, telling you this story over a fire.
Right. Yeah.
So there is a juniper tree in their courtyard, and one day the woman is peeling an apple. She cuts her finger, and blood fell in the snow, and she sighs, looks at the blood, is unhappy, and she says, well, if only I had a child as red as blood and as white as snow. And when she said that, she became quite contented. And felt sure that it was going to happen. And by golly, it does. So then in the next paragraph, there's a summary of how the months go by, and it's beautiful. The seasons change. And even though you're not told that the woman is pregnant, at the end of 9 months, she has a child. And guess what? The child was as white as snow and as red as blood. But she soon after falls sick. She's been sick during the pregnancy. And it says that she dies. And in fact, I should point this out, that it's like the instant she has the child, the instant she saw it, she was so happy that she died. Actually, it's causal. I forgot that detail.
Yeah.
So the husband grieves, and it says, and after some time he was more at ease, and although he still cried, he could bear it, period. And sometime later he took another wife. Which seemed to be kind of a funny line. So now he's married. He has a daughter by the second wife. Naturally looks at the two children, and she thinks, okay, look, this older boy is going to get more attention, going to be treated better, maybe inherit all of our wealth, and the daughter won't. And so it says, and the evil one filled her mind. Out of the blue, the evil one, capital E, capital O, filled her mind. So one day the daughter comes home and says, mother, give me an apple. And she gives her one. And then she says, mother, doesn't my brother get one too? And this made the woman angry. And she says, yeah, when he comes home, I'll give him one too. So he comes home from school, and she throws the apples into a chest. And this is where it gets great. And it says, when he came home, it was as though the evil one had entered her. So it's a little bit more ambiguous about whether it's the evil one possessing her, or if this is just something she made up or decided to do on her own. So the mother, or the little boy, comes home and says, mother, how angry you look. Give me an apple. I always love the segue. There's I think this is called parataxis, where you don't have any word that gives a logical connection or relationship between the sentences. That would be hypotaxis. So there's never a therefore or a thus, at least not often. So it's just jarring. She says, okay, you can have one. Says, oh, see the chest? Go take one out for yourself. So you picture the little boy, just big enough to lean over the chest, with the heavy chest door lurking above him. And it says, while he was leaning over, the evil one prompted her, and crash. I love the way the storyteller just makes the sound effect. And crash, she slammed down the lid, and his head flew off.
Boom.
No blood or guts. It's like a Lego figure's head pops off.
Exactly. It just flew off.
And actually it flies off, but it falls into the chest among the red apples.
Yes.
Now, this is, again, I don't know how many favorite parts I have, but this is definitely my favorite part. Then fear overcame her, and she thought, quote, maybe I can get out of this. The first thing she thinks of.
That's the first thing she thinks. How can I get away with this?
Not grief, not guilt, but how can I get out of this? Okay, and here, if you'll indulge me, I suggested before that line about Chesterton saying that kids are innocent, they want justice. Old corrupt people like me, they want mercy.
We want mercy.
This reminds me of a little anecdote. I'll try to be brief about it, where when Anthony, our firstborn, not named after you, but could have been. Part of the Tolkien line. If we'd known your direct descendant,
if you would have known this, you would have done,
I would claim it. But he's our first kid, and we're doing shifts of walking him, and he needed to be walked quite a lot. And so one night I was just so dead tired that I did something that we had agreed we wouldn't do, which I put him in the apple chest. No, I brought him into bed and laid him down next to us, and promptly fell into oblivion. And then about an hour later, I think, now 2,000 years later, at least, I woke up and I turned and I didn't see him, and it freaked me out. And there's a sheet, and I think I'd wrapped him up in a sheet. And you're always worried about sudden infant death syndrome or something like that, or a fairy coming and taking him away. And so I start to peel away the sheets like layers of an onion, and I get to the bottom, and there's nothing there.
Jeez.
I'm like, holy shit! It's like I Frosty the Snowman, my firstborn kid, and I'm panicking. And the first thing I think of is not, oh God, why have you taken my son away from me? I miss my boy, my firstborn. I think, holy shit, my wife is going to be furious. So I'm in this state of mind, you're like less than half awake even when you're awake, because the rat made you walk him all day. And he like if you stopped walking or much less sat down, he would cry because he could tell he wanted you to work. So anyway, I'm sitting there, trying to come to terms with my first murder of my own child. And at a certain point, my wife Nancy, without rolling over, modestly annoyed tone says, "I put him in his crib."
And she really wanted to say, "You idiot." At the end of that,
she might have been thinking those kinds of things. So the worst of it is that she probably knew the whole time that I was trying to figure out how to cover my tracks. In other words, I was thinking, maybe I can get out of this. So talk about fallen, talk about a corrupt adult that wants mercy. Because why do I want mercy in the stories? Because I want mercy for myself.
Right, exactly.
Anyway, my wife, God, and Anthony showed me mercy. Although now that I say that, it does occur to me that maybe that makes sense of the ninja nurse picture. About the ninja nurse picture, right?
Yes.
Because you watched the first podcast carefully, right? You and my mom.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I thought that's the only one I've watched, I should say. So I'm sorry I haven't watched them all yet.
Another thing, but that's why I'm a bad nurse. That's why I'm killing people, because he on dim level understands that I murdered him, thought I'd murdered him, and then was looking for a way to cover it up. So back to the Juniper Tree, the mother. Maybe I can get out of this. She sets him on a chair, the body that is, in front of the door. Puts the apple in his hand, and she's taken from her chest of drawers a white scarf. Remember, he's as white as snow. Out of the top drawer. I love how he tells us where it was located, and kind of ties the head on top. And then the daughter, who's given a name, Marlene, says, "What's wrong with brother? He looks totally white. He's already bled out, and he's got an apple in his hand, and he won't talk to me." And she says, "Quote, if he won't answer or will not answer you, then box his ears." So she's setting up her daughter to make it look as if she's killed her brother when actually the mother did. So of course Marlene goes back, gives him a box on the ear, and his head falls off. Who could see that coming? She's freaked out. She thinks she's murdered her brother, and so the mother, now having set her up, pretends to solve the problem for her, and she says, "We'll cook him into a stew." So they cook him into it. They chop him. Of course, the myth has to tell you the details. Took the little boy, chopped him into pieces, put him in the pot, cooked him in the stew, and Marlene stood by crying, and her tears fall into the pot. And then, as the translator renders it, and they did not need any salt. The tears salted the food. Anyway, the father comes home. The mother serves him up a quote large dish of stew, and Marlene knows what's happening, just cries and can't stop. The father eats it while he's eating.
He loves the stew. The stew is really good in the story. Like, it's delicious.
It says the more he ate, the more he wanted, and even says, "You shall have none of it." And of course, Marlene is thinking, "Okay, good." And so she makes a fib up. The mother makes a fib and says, "Oh, he's gone to live with an uncle," or something like that. Okay, so then there's this, the beginning of this dramatic upward swing, this Eucatastrophic. The Juniper Tree begins to move, and actually, this is, I think, what happens. After they cut him up, they threw the bones under the table. Marlene goes out and ties it together with her nicest scarf and buries it near the Juniper Tree, right? And so then they have this moment where this kind of weird, bizarre resurrection. The Juniper Tree begins to move, the branches spread, and then it says, just as if someone were rejoicing and clapping his hands, which is beautiful. And then a beautiful bird flies up out of this mist, singing so beautifully that everybody wants to hear it. So then he goes through the town and sings for people, and they all want to hear him sing again, and it's hilarious. The bird speaks. The bird can speak as well as sing. He always says, "I do not sing twice for nothing." So he asks for three things: a golden chain from the goldsmith, a pair of shoes from the shoemaker, and then also, ominously, a millstone from the chiselers. He goes to his house, and he sings, and I haven't told what he sings. He always sings the same song, and usually it's all in a row. Now he sings it in pieces, and you get to hear the reactions from his family. So but the song in whole goes: "My mother, she killed me. My father, he ate me. My sister Marlene gathered all my bones, tied them in a silken scarf, laid them beneath the Juniper tree. Tweet, tweet. What a beautiful bird am I. I love the tweet, tweet.
Tweet,
Just like
tweet. Yeah.
it's like not even really a good try at the sound a bird makes. So
Yeah.
anyway, to make a long story short, the daughter, her sister, she begins to feel happier and happier. The mother begins to feel more and more threatened in a way she can't understand. And the father continues to be clueless and doesn't really understand
Yeah.
what's going on. At one time, even after, in fact, exactly after the bird says to them, sings to them, my father, he ate me. The father's response is, oh, what a beautiful bird. Smells like cinnamon. It was like Homer Simpson sitcom.
Right. Right.
Anyway, so he gives the father the chain. He's happy. Gives the girl the shoes. She's happy. Reminds me of Phoebe's red shoes in The Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah.
And then mother comes outside, and the bird, the former son, gives her the millstone, crashes down. And I'll just read it because it's really short. This is the abrupt Eucatastrophe. It happens just a matter of 2-3 sentences, as Tolkien told us it would. And she went out the door, crash. The bird threw the millstone on her head, and it crushed her to death. It goes on and finishes this way. The father and Marlene heard it and went out. Smoke, flames, and fire were rising from the place. And when that was over, the little brother was standing there. And he took his father and Marlene by the hand, and all three were very happy. And they went into the house, sat down at the table, and ate.
Yeah, that's it. And they all lived happily ever after. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Hilarious, freaky,
Yes.
wonderful
Freaky
story.
Yeah.
And it does seem to me to really fit the part where Tolkien says, look, it takes you into a different time, into an other time, capital O, capital T, to this primordial world. But what about you, Tony? Do you buy it that this is a good example of eucatastrophe in the way Tolkien describes it? As I've told you, I think there's something in a way it's arguably the opposite of eucatastrophe. But what do you think?
Okay, so I think it is a eucatastrophe, only because, I mean, so the thing is, I think what he's trying to say too is, and if you think about his own work, there's horrific scenes of torture and killing in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, just like there's cannibalism in this story and mothers getting cut heads off. But the whole point is, because he has a footnote in the essay where he talks about this fairy tale, and he says something like, children shouldn't be hidden from the grossness of these tales, right? That's part of the Grimm tradition for sure.
Right.
But so I was trying to, as you were recounting it there, and I've been thinking about this too, like who makes the bad decision that turns out to be a good ending, right? And I'm not, so there maybe I am kind of struggling to find it because there's multiple decisions. It's certainly not the mother's decision. It might be the daughter's decision to knock the kid's head off when he's already dead, right? I mean, that could be because that leads to, the consequences of cutting him up and then eating him, and then she or her planting, because it's not a dumb decision to plant his bones. She's doing that out of love. So maybe it's her selfishness of wanting an apple and just knocking her brother's head off and taking the apple. Like that seems to me the bad decision that leads eventually to the brother, because she didn't kill the brother, the mother did. So that would be my take on the eucatastrophe for this one. Why don't you think it works? What's your take?
Well, you're kind of persuading me as you speak. Between you and Chesterton, I think maybe I am refuted, because what it seems to me happens here in some of the other fairy stories that I've read is that it is a kind of fulfillment of a primordial desire, as Tolkien discusses. And that seems to me to work. And it does seem to me to give us this piercing glimpse. But for me, I don't feel joy at the end. I feel freaked out. What happens at the end maybe is pleasant to a child or to an innocent soul like your own.
Yes.
Because the White Queen or Sauron is destroyed. But when I read it, I keep, what might make an impression is something like, wow, that was an implausible turn of plot. I didn't expect that to happen.
Right.
The scales had been, set out of whack like this, and then at the very end, they're jarred back into place, but like that, in this one little instant. And I guess part of it, I think I mentioned that to you, or I mentioned that when we were talking about the essay, that it seems so counter-experiential.
Yeah.
But then Tolkien did, as I was recalling only as I read the essay, he did, account for that in advance. He said, look, this is not how life usually goes.
Right.
So It seems to me to be, in a sense, a kind of, well, a wish fulfillment in two ways. And one is, and Tolkien does talk about this in the essays, for the overcoming of death.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So that was the whole first podcast was all about death.
yeah,
And of course, in Christianity, that is the way it happens. You die,
yeah,
but you can be reborn as Christ was.
yeah,
Well, Tolkien is not shying away from that is not the way life generally works, but that's the good news that happens in the Christian story. So I think the Eucatastrophic fits the Gospels perfectly, and we didn't have time to read it, but just the
yeah,
point where in the Gospel of John, say Mary comes and says, hey, look, you got to go to the tomb.
yeah.
The body is gone, and then John, well, actually, doesn't name John. It's just Peter and the
The beloved one, the beloved
yes,
disciple.
the beloved one and the one who runs faster
Yeah,
gets
yeah,
there.
right, right. Yeah,
They go into the tomb, nothing is there. And
yeah,
Mary Magdalene's outside and she sees a man in white. She thinks it's the farmer, or isn't it the farmer,
yeah,
a gardener, and
yeah,
it's Christ. And he says, I'm raised, tell
yeah,
everybody. And that's pretty abrupt too after the
yeah, yeah,
war and the gruesomeness of the passion. But
yeah,
here's the thing: when I read the Juniper Tree, and this I will, I do still see this. It seems to me that the real, I don't know, what's really fulfilling is less about the happy ending for people than it is the revenge. And
yeah,
I
yeah,
always think that the real joy of the Christian story, for those who believe in that theology, is the mercy. It's the redemption, and the idea
yeah,
that everyone is fallen since Adam and Eve. Everyone
yeah,
is a sinner. Everybody needs this kind of grace for God to sweep down and raise us back up. And so I'm thinking, is there any place for redemption for that mother, for example, who panicked? And of course, at this point, everybody is realizing I'm just projecting it because of the way I reacted when I dissolved my snowman child and didn't
right,
know what to do about it. And
right.
but if here's the thing, if the story is actually more about the primordial need for revenge and
Yeah,
justice as a
yeah,
form of revenge, a nicened up version of revenge, what
yeah,
I sometimes feel, and this is where I think I'm freaked out, is it makes me think that, and this is how I've been looking at it recently. I think that, okay, there are basically, two ways of looking at the world. One is the Christian story is true, and the other is that it's not. And all
yeah,
sorts of things
yeah,
follow from the not. And one
yeah,
is that we are at our essence not angels.
yeah,
We
yeah,
are at our essence animals.
yeah, yeah,
And it seems to me that I can imagine that the instinct for revenge, the kind of lust for revenge, the kind of satisfaction we get when we get revenge,
yeah,
that when that rings true to us, we go to this primordial time, but it's not this Adam and Eve world. It's not this
yeah,
world. It's this animal world. And that,
yeah,
I think
yeah,
that's what kind of freaks me out about the whole thing. And it's not that, I don't answer to the justice or the punishment.
yeah.
It's that I do, but it does kind of make me think, wow, that goes down deep. Is that what's going
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. Okay, so I kind of I see what you're saying, and I guess my first response would be to think clearly in the Christian tradition there's justice, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so there's all those passages where Jesus is like, you guys go to hell, you guys don't. It's like it's not like Jesus is. I mean, I think sometimes we do get a version of Jesus. I mean, you and I were both raised in the kumbaya tradition of the Catholic Church, like everybody's loved, let's play guitars and stuff. And
Yeah.
there's obviously other versions of Christianity. I mean, I like the kumbaya version, but
Yeah.
there is something about justice that's clearly, because animals don't have justice. Animals don't commit revenge, right?
Maybe I'm
They're
wrong. Yeah.
less. They
Maybe
would
I'm missing
hunt.
out on that. Yeah.
And so revenge is only a human. I mean, actually, so just a
Yeah.
little segue, I'll do it.
Yeah.
So one of the things my second book I wrote about was on punishment, at the global level, and what does punishment mean, and like how do people punish when it comes to international affairs, and so I think, and I read a lot about punishment and philosophies of punishment, and it's really interesting how justice is in the best ones. It's about justice. It's not necessarily about rehabilitation. I shouldn't say the best ones. The ones that are most connected to notions of justice are kind of retributive. They're not rehabilitative necessarily. So
Ah,
they don't express
okay.
mercy always. They are about, this person did a wrong, they have to pay their time, whatever it is. So,
Yeah.
anyways, so
That's
I can
good.
see I can see your take on the story. I can understand that. It does seem like that. And what was the word used? Parataxis. What was the word about this kind of
So
abrupt shift?
between two sentences that are like two stones together with no
Yeah,
cement, we call that
yeah,
parataxis, like parallel lines.
yeah,
Hypotaxis would be like if you had a conjunctive adverb like therefore, And so
Okay. Yeah.
this one is subordinate to this one. This is the cause of this one. So
Yeah.
there's meant between the two.
So it seems like all these fairy tales have that parentaxis idea. Like they all have this abrupt moment. I mean,
Yeah.
they don't really flow. There's no kind
Yeah.
of like, we're going to get up to this point. It's
Yeah.
like, boom,
Yeah.
this
There's no,
is,
it's very jarring. And that way it's kind of
yeah,
biblical. I got
yeah,
that term from Robert Alter, who wrote on, I think the art of biblical narrative and then the art of biblical poetry. And he introduced those terms. And it's like in the story of Isaac and Abraham, it says, God says to one morning to Abraham, take your son, the
yeah,
son you love, up to the
yeah,
mountain, top of Mount Moriah and sacrifice him to me. And then there's a
right.
period. And you go to the next sentence and you're expecting Abraham to, to lament, to complain, to
Yeah,
grieve. And it just says the next morning he got up, saddled his ass, and took his boy and some kindling for the sacrifice and began to go up Mount Moriah. So that's
yeah,
parataxis right in your face.
yeah, yeah. That's good. Yeah, yeah,
There's room to interpret. So okay, it could be Tolkien is right.
yeah.
Eucatastrophe just that. The reason I don't like it is because I'm not an innocent child. I'm an adult who's guilty and afraid of hell.
Right.
So, all right, so I want to be
Okay.
cognizant of time. I think we have 15
Yeah.
minutes to go, and I want to get into the
Okay.
politics. So let me ask you this: do you
Yeah.
want? We could talk about the Bull of Norway or any other myth or fairy story, or we could just go full politics. I will let you decide, and you lead us for the last 15.
All right, let's go full politics because I mean, I think the Black Bull in Norway, it would take us 15 minutes to go through the
Too
same kind of
complicated.
version of
Yeah.
it. So let's jump to the politics because there's lots
Okay.
of other fairy tales we could talk about too.
Yeah.
So yeah, okay,
Cool.
we use one. All right, good.
All right. So go full politics. Tell me how what connections you make with Tolkien and
Yeah.
Eucatastrophic.
Yeah. So this is a very weak read so far because I haven't really developed it. So and the great thing about this podcast, I'm so appreciative of it. It's got me to reread all this stuff and think about this. So you're helping me quite a bit. So
I
so
think
when
people like to see people think. Like I've
yeah,
noticed that when I watch Jordan Peterson, he's often working things out on the fly, and it seems that
yeah,
people
yeah,
really like
yeah,
that. So I told Tony, hey, look, trying to beg him to be my friend still into the podcast. You
yeah,
can just be a rough draft. This can be
yeah,
your
exactly,
lousy
exactly.
conference paper before you write something
Yeah, yeah,
for book 13. Okay, go
right,
for it.
exactly. So okay, so the way I write about, as I said, I write about war and the just war tradition, which is about the kind of moral evaluation of whether or not it's just to go to war and the conduct of war and all sorts of things. And at the same time, there's within, so my PhD is in political science, and many American political scientists think they're scientists. And so that means kind of generating data and doing hypotheses. And I've done a little of that in my career, but less so. Like I'm more interested in the narrative kind of approach, historical, ethical, whatever. So I've been reading about narratives and how narratives work within our theorizations of politics and international politics in particular. So, and then it kind of connected up when I read this essay again a few years ago. My brother Jim and we wrote a piece for Notre Dame Magazine that used the Eucatastrophe, used this essay to kind of critique. We critiqued, I think, or we talked about
Just make something
the
up.
Twilight books. I think we talked about the
Oh,
Twilight books. I can't remember.
ouch.
I'll post it to you, and then you could link it to
We'll put in
my
a
piece.
link, yeah, so people can
Yeah.
read. I
So
haven't read that either.
yeah. Okay. So it was a fun piece to read.
Way to keep me in the loop.
Okay. So anyways, kind of these things came together a few years ago when I was looking at how we the international community, et cetera, narrate war. So how do we tell the story about the wars we've been engaged in and the wars that we've lost? And it came out most explicitly. I remember, for those of you who are slightly older, the Yugoslav wars, right? A big part of the Yugoslav wars in the 90s was the way in which Serbia kind of used one episode in its past, which was this defeat by a Muslim army in the 1300s, I think, and told the story of how they were protected and they lost. The Serbs lost in this conflict.
Yeah.
And the Muslims were able to kind of approach, I think, Vienna. I can't remember the exact story. But
Yeah.
then they used this as a way to tell a story about themselves as heroes, even though they lost.
Yeah.
And then they tried to narrate, and they obviously lost, so to speak, the Yugoslav wars because they were bombed, et cetera, in lots of different ways by the West.
Right.
So I got thinking about that, and then I realized too that every kind of war, even by those who lose, and now there's a couple cases where this is not true, but people try to tell the story like it was a good outcome for us. We did win, or we learned something, and that we've gotten better. Now the two cases that are not really good here's the disproof of the argument is Germany post World War II, who've been very explicit about the wrongs they did, and if this kind of countries acknowledge this past. and Japan maybe a little less so, but Japan has also done the same thing post World
Yeah.
War II. But
Yeah.
certainly post World War I, Germany was not saying those things, nor was Austria,
Right.
etc.
Yeah.
And and I think we see this now more and more in the way the West fights wars. Like, even in the United States with Vietnam, there is this kind of interesting. I mean, most people would say the United States lost Vietnam War, but then other people say, well, no, we didn't lose. We came back. We've got
Yeah.
heroes who came back,
Yeah.
and they're not, they're et cetera, et cetera. So there's ways that we can't tell a story about war unless it has a happy ending.
Yeah.
So my idea is to I may do some combined data collection along with this theory and use Tolkien's idea, because the other interesting thing is in most wars, there's strategic decisions that are very poorly made that then lead to maybe outcomes that are not so bad.
I get it.
That maybe it lead to a victory of the sorts, or maybe you can tell a story that even though we lost here, it's a good outcome. So
That's that happy
that's
fault we talked about before, where someone makes this error in judgment, but it leads to this catastrophe. But it's precisely that mistake that somehow is key to the redemption or the happy ending. Yeah, very cool.
Exactly. And one of the things I've got to kind of figure out how to do. So a few years ago, I was on a podcast, not a podcast, sorry. It was the International Studies Association, which is the big professional association I'm part of. They gave me this award, and there was a panel of people that were talking about my work. And this was the first time I said this explicitly about happy endings.
Very
and
cool.
So I said about, all wars have a happy ending. And this one woman who I'm really good friends with over the years, she's a terrific scholar. Her name's Nita Crawford. And she was on the panel, and she's like, no wars have happy endings. What are you talking about? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And I was like, oh, okay, Nita. So, because it's not that, and she's like, wars are horrible. And I agree, wars are horrible. What I'm more interested in is how we being a national community, how we tell a story about our wars, how we tell a story about what happened, and why we need a happy ending. So that's what I think.
Right.
It's a very structuralist argument as opposed to post-structural argument. So, and I was going back and I was reading Carl Jung and trying to read different structural theorists about these kind of things, because I think there's something. I think Tolkien has something there that we need happy endings, and it's almost like war is a moment of where we enter on a world that doesn't make sense. So war is like fairy, because everything, the rules all change, the world seems different. So it's also like entering the world of fairy.
Well, that's cool. That's cool.
So those are some of the ideas that from Tolkien that I've got here.
That's super cool. The last one, some you'd kind of intimated in an email from long ago, but this one is new, and that's kind of scary. Everything you said is a little bit scary too. So the pendulum is kind of swinging back from the happy view to this catastrophe for me, because if you have this sub-creation, so God creates us and then we create this other world. If that is a kind of fairy story or fairy realm where
it's a fairy realm, right,
and it happens and it's real and you can't not believe in it, even though it seems unreal, that you could say is our act of sub-creation.
Right.
I mean, think about what an awful thing we potentially do by creating this rival secondary world with the that spark of divinity, which in the way we've been interpreting Genesis was the innate ability to create like God, and that's what we did with it. Congratulations to humanity. That is kind of scary.
So I'll give you my other quick politics thing, which I know we're running out of time, but my other quick politics thing is not from Tolkien, but from reading about fairy tales. And I think I mentioned this to you, Joe, and it comes actually from Andrew Lang. So Andrew Lang was actually famous in his day. I didn't mention this. He collected fairy tales from around the world and published these 12 colored fairy tale books that were hugely popular at the turn of the century. This in England in particular, in the UK in particular. But what was interesting about him, and I mentioned he wrote kind of early anthropology. There's been this debate about, are fairy tales something that are universal in form? Like, is this structure exist everywhere? Or are fairy tales specific, like the Grimm brothers thought, to a particular culture and time and place? Like the Grimms were collecting German folk tales. And so there's an interesting kind of early anthropological debate that I want to maybe draw upon to think about this interesting stuff I'm doing about universal values, this interesting stuff I'm reading. Like, do there exist universal values, and if so, what do they look like, and or is it all relativist when it comes to things like human rights, et cetera? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm making the case there are universal values,
Right.
and I think I'm going to use the
I'm on
the
board.
fairy tale thing to say, look, there's a universal form here,
Yeah.
so something like that. So that's kind of where that I might draw on the fairy tale idea to talk about human rights and things like that. So
Very cool. As I
yeah,
said, I
those are
like
my two
that.
politics things.
Very cool. I like that angle, the direction you're going into, and I tend to think that there's. I mean, I'm a universalist, I suppose.
Mm,
It's not necessarily that I think, as I think sometimes people will criticize literature or my approach to literature, or the great books approach.
yeah,
They'll
yeah,
criticize it for thinking that there is a universal truth that the teacher or the tradition of books all know.
yeah,
And I don't think that, or at least put it this way, I don't buy that they all know it part.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think there may
exactly.
be a universal truth. If God is real, for example, yeah, there's a
Yeah,
universal truth,
yeah,
and it is not a matter of social construction or tradition
right,
or
right.
caprice. Um, and if God doesn't exist, well, then that all of that is true.
Yeah,
But it seems to me, a couple of things seem to make me think universalism is true, and one is just that in the great books tradition, going back, more than 4 millennia, we're still asking the same questions. The same
yeah,
things matter to us. The very first book, Gilgamesh, at least, yeah,
yeah,
arguably the very first work of literature, the first one I talked about in podcast one,
yeah,
is he's worried about death, as
yeah,
we
yeah, exactly.
still are.
Yeah,
Um, and the other thing is just that I do think that even though it does differ over era and culture, I do think that the simple fact that almost everybody would say yes, we have an innate sense of right versus wrong.
yeah, yeah.
Doesn't mean that we apply it in the same way or that people have always
Mhm,
looked at it the same way. But again, it's like that
yeah.
perpetual asking of the question. We all seek after that. We're reading Augustine's Confessions in a class I'm teaching
Oh
now,
yeah, yeah,
and he talks about how everything that exists is good and there are
yeah,
lesser goods, and the trick is not to shun them but not to
right.
make them into idols,
Yeah,
and that will lead you inevitably towards the greatest good, which is God.
yeah,
There does seem to something, I mean, that does seem universal to me, the striving after the good or the
yeah,
true. Plato
yeah,
and all sorts of people since him
yeah,
um,
yeah,
have
yeah.
have described it.
Yeah. So no, that's and I like fairy tales because while there's a universal form, they play themselves out in all like the German Grimm brothers are different than Hans Christian Andersen, who's got a whole different tradition of fairy tales versus the British fairy tales, the Irish fairy tales. So there's lots of different ones that are to say nothing of like Indian and Chinese ones, which I'm trying to read a little bit about. So it's
Yeah,
fascinating. But I think there's a core that seems similar, and it's about either maybe it's about death, maybe it's the Eucatastrophe. I don't know what the core is, but there's
I get it.
something there.
Well, that's very cool. I look forward to hearing about that. One of the premises of my teaching in Joe's Great Books is that we are all at core irrational animals, and that's why we can talk about books and do this well. One
Yeah,
last point. Remember, I was going to say this in
yeah,
regarding your first application. It does seem to say something about the kind of the current historical moment we're at. People
yeah,
tend to feel that we're like at a late stage of something, and
yeah,
it could be that, just to summarize briefly what or the point without going into the way I got there, that if people need all wars to end happily,
yeah,
or if they write them as if they did in some way. And I looked up the battle you were talking about, where
yeah,
the Ottoman Turks, the Muslim forces overrode the Christians, but they
yeah.
look back and the Serbs say, well, this is where we preserved our faith. We could have given it up, but
Yes,
we remained Orthodox.
that's right.
There's this merger of religion and history,
Yeah,
and if God exists, well, it was a eucatastrophe, a
yeah,
divine calamity.
yeah,
If
yeah,
he doesn't, then it was just a severe example of rationalization, which
yeah,
could account for the way we write history. We give ourselves what we want or need rather
yeah,
than the facts. And it could be that what we're seeing, and so there's a kind of religious aspect to it. It could be
yeah,
that nowadays, when Germany and Japan and the United States can't quite lie to themselves anymore, they can't quite rationalize things. We're in
yeah,
this era of guilt now,
yeah,
and that does bring its own problems. We've seen,
yeah,
a lot of people are more ashamed of their country, and the U.S. especially,
yeah,
than proud. And I don't know if we're able to handle that.
yeah.
We got to at
That's a
least a
good.
balance. We don't want to
Yeah,
hide the truth, but we don't want to go overboard and only look at the gore
yeah,
and the crime.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
So anyway, we're at 38:40.
yeah,
I think we should call today. Let me just,
Okay.
again, thank you very much for spending your time
Well,
and
thank you.
talking to me about all this cool stuff. You really got me thinking. That's one of the most fun
Yeah.
parts about doing the podcast is that I learn things or relearn things.
Yeah.
And it even happens during the podcast too, as it did for me several times. So
yeah, me too. No, this was great. I really appreciate it, Joe. And I love the idea behind the whole podcast. And this was so much fun, especially good to do with a friend. It's nice that I know you and that.
Absolutely.
Yes.
No,
So
I love you, brother. I appreciate it. Oh, and I just want to finish by saying one thing.
Yeah.
Tony, I want you to know this. You can come visit me anytime.
Invite me to give a talk. Maybe that's what you should do.
So let's try it again. Tony, you can come visit me anytime.
All right, Joe, you're going to be the next Andrew Lang lecturer here at the University of St. Andrews.
I'm visiting. I'll be there tomorrow.
Absolutely. Anytime I want you to come. So, yes. So, all right.
Good seeing you, man.
All right. Good. See you too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I love that Tony guy. Bye-bye.